Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure to be back.
So today we're going to be taking a look at anxieties around the American economy.
Okay, anxieties.
Yeah, and specifically, we're looking at this through a recent Ring of Fire transcript. It's from YouTube, and we want to try to understand what exactly are the major economic concerns that they're talking about, and how widespread are these worries?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to ask because this source really does try to tap into how are people actually feeling about the economy right now, using, survey data, some commentary, and trying to connect it to what's going on right now with the current economic picture.
Gotcha. So basically, for our listeners, we'll be highlighting the main worries that this source is talking about, and then the data that they're using to back that up.
Exactly. So a nice, quick but thorough understanding of this perspective.
Perfect. Okay, so right off the bat, this transcript says that a large majority of Americans, I mean, that's a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Think that the economy is headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah. There's definitely a sense of pessimism, I think, that comes through pretty strongly.
Yeah, for sure.
In this piece.
It even compares some economic indicators to levels we haven't seen since the Great Recession.
Right, and that is kind of the point that they're trying to hammer home, right? It's not just that people are saying, oh, things aren't great, but it's like, oh, some of these numbers that we're looking at are really, really, really bad.
Yeah, this is serious stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that they highlight is that 63% of Americans, that's also a lot of people,
yes,
believe that the government just isn't doing enough to address key economic issues.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a key part of this because it's not just are things good or bad, but it's who is responsible, and what are they doing about it.
Interesting.
And this source is really making a case that the government is not doing enough.
So they break down these specific issues that people are worried about.
Yes.
And the numbers are pretty huge. 95% are concerned about rising insurance costs.
Yeah.
94% about inflation.
Right.
And we should probably, just define that quickly for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term.
Sure, yeah. Inflation is basically when you see the prices of everyday things.
Right, goods and services.
Goods and services, exactly.
Yeah.
Rising over time.
Yeah.
So your money doesn't buy as much as it used to.
Perfect.
So it erodes your purchasing power.
Yep.
That's inflation in a nutshell.
Okay, so 94% inflation, 89% are worried about the general state of the economy.
Right, and that's what's so striking is it's not just one thing.
Right.
It's like this general sense of unease about all of these factors.
Yeah, and I mean, all these numbers are really high.
Yeah, I mean, when you see numbers like that in survey data,
it's pretty significant.
It is significant. Yeah, it means this is something that's really on people's minds.
Yeah.
And then to even add to that, they also mentioned that 74% of those surveyed expect inflation to actually get worse
in the coming year.
Over the next year, yeah. And then they highlight that 70% are more concerned about inflation.
Right now. Than they were just in September.
Yeah, which was not that long ago.
Right. So things are escalating pretty quickly in terms of these concerns.
Absolutely. It seems like the worry is growing.
So then there's this approval rating for how the economy is being handled right now, which is only at 39%.
Yeah, that's pretty low.
Yeah, pretty low. And the commentary, they essentially describe the approach as doing nothing.
Right. And this is where you start to see the sort of political perspective coming in a little bit more strongly because obviously, different people would have different opinions on what is or is not being done.
Right.
But the source is clearly framing this as a lack of action.
Okay. So moving on, the source also points out that 81% of Americans are concerned about tariffs.
Yeah.
Or a global trade war.
Which, again, thinking about these anxieties, like trade wars are not typically seen as a good thing for most people.
And 72% think that these tariffs will have a negative impact on the economy.
Right. And if we connect this back to inflation, Rez, one of the big concerns about a trade war is that it can actually lead to higher prices.
Right.
Because if you're putting tariffs on goods coming in from other countries, that can drive up the cost of those goods.
Yeah. And disrupt supply chains as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that disruption in supply chains can also lead to shortages and further price increases.
Right. So all these anxieties are kind of feeding into each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's all interconnected.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like all this anxiety, right, is actually leading to some real changes in how people are spending their money. The source mentions that 58% of Americans are cutting back on non-essential expenses.
Right. Because they're worried about what's to come.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is really where you start to see the rubber hit the road, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to say, oh, I'm worried about the economy. It's another thing to actually start changing your behavior.
Yeah.
And the examples that they give
Yes.
are pretty telling. You know, things like clothing, fuel and gas, and even groceries.
Which I found really interesting.
Right.
I mean, I would tend to think of those as essential.
Yeah. Yeah, especially groceries.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to the level of concern.
Right.
That people are actually considering cutting back even on things that we might normally consider essential.
So it seems like all these big worries, right, are trickling down to individual shopping habits.
Yeah.
Like the transcript mentions Walmart CEO Doug McMillon observed these stress behaviors on customers.
Like buying smaller quantities of things.
Yeah. Right. So people are either not buying things or buying less of them.
Right. Exactly. And this is a trend that economists really pay attention to, because if consumer spending starts to decline, that can be a sign of a weakening economy. A
sign of a recession on the horizon.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it's a complex issue.
Right.
But it is one of those things that they look at as a potential warning sign.
Yeah. So finally, this source is very clear on where it places the blame for all these economic anxieties.
Right.
It basically says, and I'm quoting here, 100% of it is because of Donald Trump.
Right.
Linking all this negativity and the potential economic downturn to his decisions.
Right. And that's a very strong statement.
Absolutely.
And again, it's important to remember that while the survey data might show that people are concerned, this direct attribution of cause is the specific interpretation of this source. It's their viewpoint.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into this transcript, it seems like there's this picture of very real economic anxiety in America.
Right.
With some of the key concerns being insurance costs, inflation, and then just this overall
unease about the economy.
Yeah, unease about the state of the economy.
And anxieties about what the government is or isn't doing.
Exactly.
And then those anxieties about potential trade issues.
Right.
And all of this seems to be leading to people actually changing their behavior.
Yeah.
Spending less money even on basic necessities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is pretty significant.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this whole idea that people are already adjusting their spending, right? In anticipation of tougher times. That kind of leads us to a final thought for our listeners.
Right.
I mean, if we're seeing a lot of people having to adapt this way, right?
Yeah.
Because of these anxieties, what are some of those bigger, broader strategies?
Yeah.
Whether it's societal, individual, that might be important for navigating the potential for like a real economic downturn.
Right.
I mean, it's a question of how do we adapt when we're faced with these kinds of worries and these anxieties?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important question for all of us to consider.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about, oh, are things good or bad?
Right.
It's about, okay, if things are potentially going to get worse, what can we do to prepare ourselves and to make sure that we're as resilient as possible?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.